was echt een ding dat wij die oplossen. Dus als we weggaan, dan moeten we iets anders gaan. Dus we gaan nu dus die weekenden ook. Ik wil een beetje focus hebben, maar zo hebben we ook de dag van de waarheid. Ze komen mensen observeren, we hebben iedere keer een oh, we're in the Shanghai. Ga je mee met de reis? Ga je mee? Echt? Ja, maar het was nu alweer de wachtlijst voor. Dus mensen, oh ja, maar dan is het veel plek.
Ja, ik heb het gelijk...
ja, dat ben ik aan het rekenen.
Oké, leuk. En jullie waren echt speciaal?
Ja, dus ik heb nu op de burn gezet, ja, maar ik liep achter tot die voor zo. Oké. Ja, we zijn echt alleen maar bezig met andere dingen, behalve Vita. Ze zitten dingen aan zitten in heel straat opzetten.
Ja.
Dus ik heb nu veel werk. Studie dat gehad hier. Dus ik zat in de trein en ik dacht, nou, ik ga nu erop zetten dat ik hier zit.
Ja, goed afvoeren.
Zeker, ja. We zien elkaar weer. En sowieso, er wordt een hele gave reis.
Ja, dat kan je ook niet.
Weet je, het is ook leuk. Nee, ik ben helemaal in Lijn is een jacket.
Some people feel funny about that. Dames en heren, welkom. Welkom iedereen. Wat fijn dat er zo'n volle zaal zit. I'm going to switch to English because we have a very international group of presenters and English is the language we share. And I hope all of you are happy with that. Many of us also speak Dutch in different ways, so when we get to the questions, you feel more comfortable asking your question in Dutch, please do so. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anne Gerritsen, and my position and the way in which I'm hosting you here is the Chair of Asian Art, which is largely supported by, not exclusively, but largely supported by the KVVAK. And the KVVAK has held, in conjunction with various other organizing groups, including Ikigai, a Young Scholar Symposium. And over the years, this Young Scholar Symposium has grown into something quite complicated and something quite focused on the presentations and something quite selective in its process. And this year we wanted to do things slightly differently. We wanted actually to invite all the students who are interested in working with Asian art in very different ways, who are based in the Netherlands, and to bring them together and to offer them an opportunity to network with each other, to create connections, to find out what people do, how people gain the experiences they have, how they became the budding scholars that they are. And in order to make that event, which happened this morning, and it was wonderful, also something that more people could enjoy, where we could bring this young student community together with the also young, but young in different ways perhaps, membership of the KVVAK, we thought we would invite some of these students to present their work. I'm going to hand over to them. I'm going to ask each of them when they speak to introduce themselves. So they will say who they are and where they've come from, and then they will tell you something about their research. And I want to add, for all of you right from the start, I want to invite you to be supportive and to be curious, and if you want to be critical, of course you're welcome to do so, but in the spirit of thinking that these are people who have only just embarked on their journeys, who are quite new to presenting, maybe to presenting in English, maybe to presenting their research. So we will see how it goes. I will try not to be too strict with the timekeeping, although I will, of course, keep an eye on it. And we only have 2 hours. We have 5 presentations. And then I will try, this will be my challenge, to bring all of these ideas together with some of the thoughts we shared this morning when we were having our networking meeting and when we had our curatorial exercise in the galleries, plus my experience of supervising about 12 PhD students, to tell you a little bit about where the field of Asian art seems to be going in the hands of beginning scholars, junior scholars and students. So that will be my task at the very end, and I will do my best to keep everything within time. But first, I think we will not interrupt with questions, but let the students all present in a row. They've all been given very clear instructions. So I hope you enjoy the series of talks that you will hear, and I will just, if I have to, remind the students to introduce themselves before they start speaking. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, and I think that's Koen. Over to you, Koen.
Hi, happy to be here. So, my name is Koen, and I will be starting in September on a new research project here in the Rijksmuseum, which I'll tell you something about today as the Johan Huizinga Fellow. So the Rijksmuseum has a few fellowships every year. Johan Huizinga Fellowship is one of these, and I applied for this to focus on photo albums made by Dutch colonial entrepreneurs depicting the lives of Chinese laborers. So this is not super art focused, but I'll get into art a few times, hopefully. I'll quickly introduce myself. I did my BA in China Studies at Leiden University, so I'm a sinologist, I'd say. And then I did my research master in Asian Studies there as well. And during my research masters, I focused on the establishment of a Chinese consulate in the Dutch East Indies, which happened in 1911. And I was very interested in the earlier encounters between China and the Netherlands. You probably know that from art or from porcelain or those kind of things. But diplomatic representation from the Dutch in China and from the Chinese in the Netherlands only happened in the 19th century, which is quite late, because the Qing dynasty was rethinking how it would engage with the world. And while going through the Dutch National Archives, het Nationaal Archief, I found that most of the Dutch-Chinese relations at the time were very much focused on, let's say, purchasing or getting the Dutch hands on cheap Chinese labor to replace slave labor, which was abolished in the 19th century as well. So I was really interested in what kind of traces are there, what kind of things did we see. And to research that, I did a proposal, which I called this, Ties That Bind, a social history of Chinese indentured labor in the Dutch East Indies through the eyes of Dutch colonial entrepreneurs, which is way too long, but short. Ties That Bind has a nice ring to it, I thought. So, before I can talk you through my upcoming project, I have to cover some history first. And I'm starting in 1863, and I'll start with a nice image as well, which you can see here. This is a vase from the Rijksmuseum, and this vase was owned or was given to Jacob Theodor Kremer, who was an administrator of the Delhi Maatschappij. So on Delhi, there would be a lot of tobacco plantations where Chinese laborers would work. And looking at this object, how far can I move without? Okay, sure. I'll look at this I'll look to the screen like this. On this object, we can see his name, and we can see some very nice Chinese motifs as well. And without going too much into the art or the object itself, I think it's very interesting, because this Jacob Theodor Kremer, he built a lot of wealth through his life as the administrator of this Delhi Maatschappij. And the Delhi Maatschappij was let's say, a group of companies, or let's say companies in the Dutch East Indies, which imported Chinese laborers to work as cheap laborers on the tobacco plantations. But that wasn't the only part in the Dutch East Indies where we would actually see Chinese laborers pop up. On the other side, for instance on Bangka and Belitung, we had the Chinese tin miners, usually Hakka Chinese, who would work in the tin mines also for very little money, because it was indentured labor. Everyone knows what indentured labor or contractarbeid is? Kind of get to it. I won't cover it. I will. Okay, so let's say contractarbeid or indentured labor was labor where people would have to pay off their contracts, and usually people weren't convinced to do it. It wasn't the cleanest type of business or contract, let's say it like that. So there was often coercion involved, abuse, and very poor work and living circumstances for these people. And the Chinese laborers mainly went to Delhi and Bangka and Belitung, which you can see on the map, which is also from the Rijksmuseum, because I use Rijksmuseum images, because that's cool. And closer up, we can see where the islands are. So the tin mines, tin would be here, usually, or mines, and the tobacco plantations would be more on Sumatra itself, especially up to the north. Now, without covering how the acquisition of Chinese laborers went, which was a very difficult, long process that the Dutch tried to get very clear, steady hands on, but the Chinese never allowed, I'll have to tell you something about the Chinese protection. So the Qing dynasty, which you know probably, the Qing dynasty didn't really have diplomatic representation abroad for a long time. But by 1873, we had the so-called Cuba Commission, which went to Cuba and Peru, where a lot of Chinese laborers worked. And they started to check or look into the working circumstances. The conclusion was that there was very clear mistreatment. And this sparked Chinese diplomats to, or at least diplomats-to-be to go abroad and also actively protect Chinese laborers abroad who didn't really have a voice in this. To illustrate it, we have an illustrated description of living hell from 1874, which is in the Leiden University collections. You can see it on the right, there's text, and on the left we can see a very scary image, I'd say, which was widely circulated in Guangdong at the end of the Qing dynasty during this time. And it had a very clear purpose. It was to scare, but also to make people aware of what kind of working circumstances there would be if you would go abroad for the Chinese people. You can see here that we have Spanish colonial, well, sailors, let's say, cutting off a queue from a Chinese laborer. Cutting off a queue wasn't a very nice thing to do. Queues were very important at the end of the Qing dynasty. But it's just a description and just a small image of what kinds of treatment these people received. And that really got me thinking, what kind of traces are there in the Netherlands? Because there's a lot of Chinese laborers who go to the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch East Indies is the place where indentured labor is maintained as basically is one of the longest periods in time. Till the 1940s, there are still Chinese indentured laborers in the Dutch East Indies working, though the amount of them is relatively much smaller than compared to people from Java, for instance. And while thinking of an application for this fellowship, I went to the website, which is very nice. You can go through the collections, but I've never seen any of these things in real life yet, because this whole research project has to start. It's not done yet. I have to do everything still. I went through it, and I started looking at the kinds of images there were. And we see these kinds of images in the collections from what I could screenshot or download from the website. Here we see Chinese laborers. It says presumably Chinese laborers, but maybe someone can see that giveaway that's a Chinese laborer. It's not very zoomed in, but if you look at the hairstyle of the people, it's very clear that they wear a Manchurian queue, if you can look closely and squint your eyes close enough. I didn't go for a zoom in yet, which means they're definitely Chinese. We can see them in the docks, right? We can see them arriving, in this case, in Sumatra. We have other images of their lives, of their homes, or where they lived, which is also, I'll give you a few seconds to look at it. We have images of their, these are called gongxi or gongsis in Chinese, which are associations of Chinese in the Dutch East Indies as well, but can be anywhere, basically around the world, where there would be a significant number of Chinese. And we have images as well showing their actual work. Anyone knows what this happens to be? Tobacco, right? Very clearly, they're working on tobacco. But when you look at this, I'd like to ask you, what do you think? What are you feeling when you look at an image like this? There are two bosses, there are two controllers. This is actually, I'm doing my research right now. I'm asking you to do it, okay? So what are you seeing? Two bosses who very clearly are white. Do you see women? Do you think the women are Chinese? Why not? It's very clear that all Chinese laborers were always male. Chinese laborers would basically always be male when they went abroad. Now, who would be Chinese? Probably the people wearing a queue, right? And do you think that there's anything wrong or right about this picture? I don't have to have a perfect answer. I'm really curious. Op de grond zitten, they're on the ground. Does it look very different than what you would expect from the 19th century? The late 19th century? No, right? So if you would send this back home, do you think you would be happy as a person who would make this photo to show it to your peers or to the families at home? You think you would be proud? No? Maybe, right? They're happy to have work. Oh, I'm not speaking about the laborers. I'm sorry, I have to make it clear. I'm speaking about the people who owned these plantations. The owners of the plantations. The owners of the people's contracts. You would be quite proud, right? You were a good colonial entrepreneur. You made a lot of money. Well, the Chinese weren't very happy with it. And in the Chinese archives, we find petitions. The Chinese archives, I'm speaking of the Taiwanese archives for the Foreign Affairs Department, which you can find online if you're interested. We have reports from Chinese diplomats and also from the Chinese themselves, petitions, writing for protection, which wasn't established at the time yet. And that got me interested still, because what are the people making these albums showing and what aren't they showing? So what I am envisioning to do in my project starting in September is looking at these kinds of images. I want to see what the working circumstances are, what the living circumstances are, but I really want to compare it with what we see in the Chinese archives, which I have now an image of the Chinese archives, but I haven't any images of that archive yet because they're online. I didn't think you would read Chinese. So let's stay with this one. I want to compare what's happening between these things. And I want to see what the function of photo albums like this was. Why did people make these albums? Why did they bring them back? And what kind of images did you want to show and did you not want to show? Because it's very clear in the early 20th century, like the 1900s, 1910s, what kinds of problems there are with Chinese labor abroad. Also in the Dutch side, we have reports. Maybe you've read books from Jan Breeman, who has written a few very good books about Chinese labor as well, but mainly indentured labor, including the Chinese. I want to compare these sources. That's my main research interest. And without giving you any conclusions, because I haven't done it yet, I would like to at least show you some of these images, that you know what's going to happen. And I would love to hear any questions about what you find interesting or what you think these albums as a function might have, or what these kinds of images and working circumstances would have been like in the Chinese situation in the Dutch East Indies. So, very nice. That's 30 minutes. It's very nice in 15 minutes. Can I ask a question? Can they ask questions now, or? At the end. Okay. So save your questions. Then for me, that's a short overview of my upcoming research, which I was doing here. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them in an hour or so. Yeah. Thank you. Who's next?
Good afternoon. My name is Ruowei, and I'm very glad to be here to share one of my studies during my master's thesis. I'm very interested in the Chinese export art, so I studied from the Chinese export porcelain for my master's thesis, and I turned to the Chinese export paintings for my PhD thesis. But today I want to share part of my master's thesis for you. The title is The Porcelain Design, Lady with Parasol in the European Context. So maybe some of you have already seen this kind of patterns from the collections from the Rijksmuseum and other collections in the Netherlands. The Lady with Parasol was designed by the Dutch artist Cornelis Ponck in 1730s, who was commissioned by the Dutch East India Company, VOC, to make drawings of porcelains and ordering special porcelains from East Asia. So in the center, we can see an Oriental-style woman by the water's edge leans forwards to waterfall, while another woman shelters her from the sun with a parasol. And in the outer ring, elements of the central image recur. This is not a new research materials and not a new research topic. Research on Prague porcelain has already been quite extensive. The most inspiring research comes from Professor Christiaan Jörg in 1980, provided a systematic review and study on the porcelain designs by Pronk. Based on previous studies, my master thesis explored how the Lady Parasol pattern was transformed through the interaction between European taste and Asian porcelain making within the context of global trade. This study draws on transcultural studies and mediation theory. But today, I want to focus on the origin of this pattern. What inspired Pronk's design? What interactions did it have with European visual resources and trends? Previous studies have shown that Pronk might have been inspired by prints and records from European travelers to the East. For example, the sketch on the left by Johan Huizinga, who accompanied the Dutch embassy to China, depicts parasol used by the Chinese court, although it lacks accuracy to some extent. And Pronk may also have been inspired by chinoiserie-themed art, such as the Meissen porcelain on the right. As we know, chinoiserie is not a true representation of Chinese artistic style. It blended references to Indian, China, and Japan in European form. It's more like part of exoticism, which is a European invention. Just as Benjamin Schmidt argued in his book, there is a trend of inventing exoticism around the early 18th century, and the Dutch played an important role in reconceptualizing the images of the globe and devising a new mode of representing the non-European world at the time. What intrigues me is not only the resources Pronk utilized, but also the logic and reasons behind how he organized the material. Following the context of the development of exotic images in the 18th century, I aim to further analyze the case of the Lady Parasol, considering the strategies employed in Pronk's design. I suggest that Pronk did not only choose a visual expression of global symbol, the parasol, but also placed it into a European or Dutch scenario, which primarily refers to the fashion of botany and gardens. First, the parasol might be considered as the central element. A parasol is primarily used for protection from exposure to the sun. In ancient times, images of parasols with supporting long handles were present in both Europe and Asia. However, during the 16th and 18th century, through the encounter and exchange between East and West, Asian parasols became popular with a highly symbolic meaning. Furthermore, in the eyes of Westerners, as mentioned in the second text here, the canopy or sunshade, sangai, used by the Chinese in ceremonies was considered similar to the one in India. This may help us to understand why the parasol designed by Pronk does not resemble the Chinese tradition, but is instead closer to the parasol Indian artificials. But by the early 18th century, the parasol in China and India may have been indistinguishable for the European audience. And during the global expansion of Europe, not only in Asia, but also in Africa and the Americas, people appeared alongside the similar parasol in images by the European travelers or designers. The parasol served as a universal symbol of identity and power, and images of Oriental figures with parasol were ubiquitous in Europe during the 17th and 18th century. Meanwhile, officials of the VOC merchants involved in Asian trade also utilized the parasol as a symbol to express their status. The VOC designated Batavia, now Jakarta, as the hub of its trading network in Asia from 1619. From the image, it's evident that the parasol also held significance as a status symbol in Javanese culture. Consequently, the Dutch residents in Batavia adopted the local custom of using the parasol to signify their appropriation of power. The parasol became so popular among the merchants in Batavia that the VOC later issued regulations restricting its use. But still, this fashion later spread among the Dutch women in Batavia, and Pronk porcelain ordered by the VOC mostly passed through Batavia as a transit station. Therefore, it is quite likely that Prang considered the potential purchasing preferences of VOC personnel. The parasols could also have been brought back to the Netherlands by VOC merchants from Batavia, ultimately influencing domestic taste. The European women were increasingly depicted with attendants holding parasol, and Prang may have captured this trend, with his parasol lady symbolizing this transformation. Therefore, the parasol lady could also be interpreted as a European lady. If we return to Prang's design, it's intriguing to observe that the figures are positioned by the water side, with a group of waterfall occupying nearly half of the central picture. The lady raises her hand, appearing to interact with the waterfall. However, the precise meaning of this interaction between the lady and the birds remains unclear. If we examine more designs by Prang, we would discover that he emphasized the use of flora and fauna elements. I would argue that Prang draws inspiration from the exotic botany and garden fashion in the Netherlands of that era, rather than simply copying scenes from chinoiserie. In terms of the design, Lady parasol, art historian Angela Hall believed that it showcases the fashion of upper-class European women's domestic life. She argues that Prang's composition, along with the actions of the lady, recalls 17th and 18th century Dutch depictions of young, wealthy women in affluent households engaged in activities such as feeding or training pets. However, the female characters depicted by Prang are all outdoors, either near water or under pavilions. Moreover, the birds in Lady's parasol are clearly not confined in cages, but rather depicted as waterfall in outdoor habitat. In my view, another plausible explanation is that Prang opted for garden scene rather than domestic settings. During the 17th to 18th century, the development of gardens in the Dutch Republic was closely intertwined with botany. And gardens were not only designed and owned by men, but also by upper-class women who pursued self-fashioning and botanical knowledge through nature and gardening. For instance, in this family portrait of a Dutch silk trader, his wife is depicted holding flower, while their daughter displays a drawing of the same flower, suggesting that these ladies were engaging with activities related to botany. Furthermore, rather than showing a Chinese lady, Prang might take reference directly from portraits of European lady. Particularly notable is the portrait of the botanical artist Maria Sibylle Marion, who worked in Amsterdam since the 1690s. Her gesture of holding the flower and the pavilion in the background bearing a striking resemblance to Prang's design of the Arbor Lady. This similarity suggests that Prang was influenced by the domestic trend among women of studying botany, and the elements surrounding the border of this plate may even have been directly borrowed from Maria's drawing of exotic plants and insects. The use of water scenery by Prang showed a taste for exoticism, and the various types of waterfall depicted in Lady's parasol might draw inspiration from plants of fauna. Exotic birds were highly popular in Dutch gardens during that era. For instance, the Dutch art collector and horticulturalist Agnes Blok constructed an estate called Weverhof, which featured large ponds and an aviary filled with exotic birds. In general, the popularity of gardens, the exploration of nature, and the fascination with the exotic were interconnected. Perhaps we should view this lady as a European upper-class woman dressed in an oriental attire, placed within the exotic realm of nature. The servant holding a symbolic parasol implied her social status, while the presence of birds suggests an exotic natural environment. and the interaction between the lady and birds may symbolize the European perspective towards the exotic. This design extends beyond merely incorporating Chinese style or chinoiserie elements. It encompasses a garden of natural wonders that opens the door to the exotic world. To make a new chinoiserie design, as we see, Prunk chooses a shared symbol of social identity in both the East and the West, that is the parasol, and take reference from the visual representation of flora and fauna with gardens closely, presenting actually a lady in the European scenario, exploring the exotic world. But that's not the end of the story. While craftsmen from China and Japan produced porcelain featuring this design, the European potters also engaged in replication. One of the most notable examples is the combination of the lady with parasol with the velour pattern. There is also an Oriental love story behind this pattern, which is similar to the West chamber, 西厢记. But unlike the lady with parasol, the velour pattern clearly originated from the landscape pattern found on Chinese porcelain. And what I want to emphasize here is that it's the fusion of such Chinese-inspired patterns and its Oriental narratives with the lady with parasol that ultimately integrates the latter into Chinese storytelling context. So the lady here finally become the character of the velour pattern story, waiting for her lover in this secret garden. So in conclusion, the transformation of lady with parasol in Europe actually concerns two aspects. First, the process of creating an exotic world, and second, the way to imagine it. This is not just a two-dimensional image reflecting an imagination of the East. It responds to the European context and also filled with a narrative afterlife. We might step out of the framework of chinoiserie and consider more possibilities for image creation in a cross-cultural context. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yang, and I am a research master student in art history from Utrecht University. I would like to first thank you for inviting me here to give a speech on my ongoing project right now. The title of my presentation is Diasporic Chinese Objects in a Dutch Missionary Museum. Here is the plan of my presentation. I will first give a brief introduction of the term diasporic objects and an overview of the missionary collection in the Netherlands. Then I will present my case study on the Style Missionary Museum. Then I will focus on two specific objects within the museum, also the style of their display, and then come to my conclusion. So first, diaspora is a term that is commonly associated with the study of human migration to describe the dispersion of people from their original homeland. Diasporic objects refers to things that are detached from their places of origin and through subsequent use and ownership that they are attached with sets of new meanings. How can the term be a productive metaphor? My research uses this metaphor of diaspora as a theoretical framework to map out the condition of certain objects in a Western ethnographic collection that have an origin of non-Western location. In particular, missionary collections, which are quite understudied in today's context. Increasingly in the recent decades, that scholars are using the framework of diasporic objects. However, that as you can see in the Rijksmuseum, that is still the objects like the Buddhist statue within the collection of these larger institutions that has more focus. For things, especially the daily objects in the missionary collection, is largely forgotten today. And these objects are of no smaller amount. Here is a list comprised by my professor from religious studies at Utrecht University. There are more than 29 missionary collections in the Netherlands. And the ones that I underlined here are the missionary collection that contain Chinese objects. So you can see this is actually quite a massive collection. Today, I will focus only on one of them, which is actually a very important missionary collection in the Netherlands. They have about 3,700 to 5,000 items within the collection. This is the Style Missionary Museum. A large part, almost a half of the objects are from China. To start off, I would like to briefly talk about the history of the museum. So it is developed by the Catholic congregation called the Society of the Divine Word, the SVD. It was founded in 1875 by the Catholic father Arno Jansen in Style in the south of the Netherlands, which is near the German border. Starting with their first mission to China in 1879, the foreign objects they collected started to pile up. Yeah, this is an overview of how the collections are placed in the museum right now. You see the image on the right. And in the 1930s, Brother Beckmans, which is the guy with the beard, he officially opened up the missionary collection to the public into a museum. It was displayed in the style of cabinets of curiosities. You can see here in the middle. So the collection is displayed to facilitate the propaganda of the missionaries. Of course, these things are presented as cult religion of the indigenous society and show the savageness of the local people, thereby to emphasize the necessity of the missionaries. It was aimed to educate the prospective missionaries, also to gain funds. What is colonial about the collection is that in the end, it was the intervention of the missionaries that have made these objects of power become diasporic and no longer valuable to their sources of origin. So they are mission trophies, and they have become worthless to their original context, to their original owner who have been converted to Christianity. Now I would like to explain my point more in detail. Here is a Chinese ancestral altar. As you can see here on the left, 2 images, and on the right is an image of the 2 panels inside of the altar. There are names written about the ancestor of the owner of this altar piece. And they were collected by Father Ruowei in the province of Shandong in China in 1913. He reported that it was sold by a Chinese woman who were coming from a rich family but later lost their fortune, so they converted to Christianity. Since this house altar is no longer useful to them, she offered it to Father Wake as a shrine for Catholic worship. You should know that commemorating one's ancestor is a very important Confucius tradition in China at that time, especially in the region of Shandong, the birthplace of Confucius. The house altar are private items. They should be burned down when they are no longer in use to help the soul settle in the realm of death. Not burning them and selling them to a missionary father is considered highly disrespectful in the Chinese context at that time. Moreover, many Chinese people who converted to Christians are called rice Christians at that time because they are offered some material benefits such as food, rice. So it has nothing to do with personal belief or spirituality. And here we can see the articulation of power relations. consider all these circumstances, it is not impossible that a woman have to sell her valuable properties and give up her belief in order to survive. So missionaries' terms like abandoned and purchase are actually really suspicious. It may cover up the fact that the giving up of an object was involuntary and under high pressure. Then on the left, you can see an honorary carpet, which is a pink carpet behind the mannequin and the column. I'm sorry about the picture quality because there's no way I can find a better angle. On the right, you can see it's a label introducing the story of the object, which is actually it's the longest label within the whole museum about the Chinese object. So this shows a letter from a Swedish father in 1902 about this carpet. According to him, it belongs to a brutal Chinese tyrant who tortured a missionary. And I traced this person and find out that his Chinese name is Zhou Tianjue. You can see the English spelling there on the right. He was born and later burned in Yanggu in Shandong province in 1853, where the missionaries acquired this carpet. Usually, such a carpet should stay in his grave. However, I discovered that his grave is no longer there, leaving only the gravestone. I cannot find out what exactly happened between his death and the year the missionaries acquired this carpet. Maybe his grave was stolen and then all these objects just went down to the market. But it is a pity that this person's identity is not accurately presented, because Zhou actually played an important role in the Taiping rebellion against the civil armies, and he is also kind of the colleague of the one who burned, who is called Lin Zexu, who burned all the drugs in China. As mentioned earlier, the display is in the style of cabinets of curiosity, which favored the taxonomy and moralization of objects. So the museum followed this arrangement, organizing its collection according to an evolutionist view of the civilization, which is popular at that time, with objects from China, Japan, and Indonesia up in the front, Papua New Guinea in the middle, and African objects in the far end. Then there are all these animal specimens, which is very racist and very problematic. Also characteristic of the cabinet is that there is a singular perspective dominate the whole display. As you can see here, there are labels, but they are very simple and it indicates the name and their function of these objects, like a teapot. So situated right opposite the ancestral order are some blood-stained clothes of the two SVD missionaries, Helen and Nice, who were murdered in Juye in Shandong, China during their stay. They were killed in 1897 by a local self-defense group called Big Sword Society. The group's initial target was actually not Helen and Nice, but another local priest who was reported having raped at least 10 Chinese women. They killed Helen and Nice out of mistake, but it was not incidental, since the discontent with foreign missionaries' involvement in local lawsuits had accumulated for a while. The deaths of the two missionaries soon became the pretext of Germany's occupation of Shandong. Their blood-stained clothes had been transported to Style and hung in a collection as relics of martyrs ever since. On the right is a picture from the 1930s. It was more bloody than how it is now today. So recently, in 2015, the museum has a new collection plan that they decided to call this museum a museum within a museum, thereby keeping this historic and problematic way of presenting to frame it as a time capsule. Well, they also have some contemporary interventions, aside from just keeping everything as what they was in the past. So here you can see it's an introductory video that you can see it upon your entrance. However, the whole video is still a propaganda of the missionary. As you can see, I'm not sure whether you can see it clear, but it shows it justifies the missions through scientific endeavors and supposed benevolence. Still a missionary propaganda. Then the second measure is QR codes, but only a very small portion of the objects has the QR codes. And what is presented in the QR codes are only the basic introduction of the category of the object, not their provenance or individual story. This is the part that I found the most problematic. It's an activity for children that you can light up a candle to commemorate the murdered missionaries Helen and Niece. However, with this image, yeah, so it is kind of linking the persecution of missionaries to the deaths of Helen and Niece, which was not the case. And then there is this voiceover saying how respectful Helen and Niece were to the local Chinese people, and thereby also justifying their activities in China. So here comes my conclusion. As I demonstrated above, like all these contemporary interventions, like QR codes and activity for children, they can be useful, but what they are doing now is to promote the mission propaganda. Also, that you should consider many of these objects, they were not the victim of violent looting. So they're kind of in a really awkward position that their acquisition was a more equivocal process, often through trading and gifting, although it was often done under the pressure of unequal power relations in a broader colonial context, as we can see in the case of the Outer. Due to their unclear provenance and their status as daily objects in the past, rather than objects with great heritage or cultural values, it is difficult for them right now to be returned to their places of origin, even though today we are all talking about restitutions in Dutch museums. There are just simply so many of these things in China. They might be very valuable for the family of their origin for some emotional value. However, what if the community, what if the family of their origin do not want them back? Do we just leave them like this? We should note that these objects, while currently still being the reminders of the sense of detachment, they can become culture ties that connect the diasporic population with their cultural heritage. It all depends on how the museum present them, but certainly not in this way. And yeah, that will be my future research. So thank you so much for your attention.
Test. Does it work? Yes, it does. All right. I'm going to use this because I think I like to walk. I don't know. Hi. Don't look at this yet. It might not be finalized yet. My name is Zeno. There is me, as you can see. I am a Leiden University Research Master Student of Asian Studies. And I am interested, I'm taking you across the pond to Japan. I'm interested in the Japanese cultural history visualized through popular media, visual media, and specifically these socio-cultural critiques that are done through symbolism or iconography. And this is often seen through the technique of mitate, which I will explain in a bit. So yeah, my research question for now is, how can we understand the declining dynamics of parodic and satirical elements, mitate, in popular visual arts during the early Meiji period? It's not finalized yet, as I just said, because I'm thinking more of the dynamics between different satirical techniques in the early Meiji period and how they changed. And of course, what replaced them. So this is of course not very clear yet, but I hope after this presentation it will be. That's my goal. So I'm gonna explain it. Oh, and last week I released my first article, so just a little bit of self-promoting. You can read it at Leap. If you type in Leap Leiden, then you come at the Graduate Journal of Leiden University, which is kind of a similar subject. It's about the satirical elements of woodblock prints, and specifically how the samurai were portrayed as anthropomorphic animals, to satirize them and to offer critique to the shogunate. Oh, all right. Maybe. Okay. Thank you. Maybe I'll just put that there. I'm going to change to a standing position if that's better. Yes? Okay. Right. So first, some historical context of the Edo period. The Edo period in Japan was from 1603 until 1868. It's a time of peace and prosperity. The country was very closed. No one was allowed out, no one was allowed in, except for the Dutch, but that was very small. And this peace also came from it being ruled by the very neo-Confucian strict government of the Tokugawa shogunate. But this also means that there was prosperity, right? And this was done through the terakoya, which were kind of private institutions, schools for the common classes. So in Japan you had 4 castes. Of course, at the top were the samurai, and then you'd have the farmers, the craftsmen, and the merchants, which were all kind of part of a commoner class, right? And yeah, it's called the Edo period specifically because formerly Tokyo was called Edo, which is the capital of Japan at this time, and this is where many things happened that are important for my research. So when I'm talking about this, I'm mostly talking about Edo, Tokyo. So yeah, because of this, these terakoya, the literacy rates increased a lot among the commoners, and you'd have these periods where the classic tales, like the tale of Genji and the tale of Ise, became very popular. They were kind of a hype. So these were very popular among the commoners. And this also made it possible to incorporate them in other kinds of media, not only in kabuki theater, for instance, but also in the nishiki-e, which are multicolored woodblock prints. You can see one here of Edo. And these multicolored woodblock prints were very popular among the commoners as well, because they were very cheap, as they were mass-produced, and they would incorporate a lot of popular themes like kabuki, courtesans, actors, landscape, battle scenes, photos, etc. You'd have a lot. But this dynamic between literacy and popular classics and a very popular visual medium made it possible for the incorporation of each other in each other. Anyway, which made it possible for mitate to exist, which is a visual rhetorical technique used to make references to older tales or mythical stories that the common people would know, and they depict it in a contemporary scene, or the other way around. You'd have, I'll get into that later. There are different definitions. It could also mean by replacing a certain subject with an entirely different subject that have no relation in the real world whatsoever. There's a third definition. I didn't include it here because that would be a little too much explaining. Oh, right. And now, what is mitate, you might ask, of course, because there's words, but it doesn't make sense yet. We have 2 kinds of prints here. on the right, we have the original visual depiction of one of the scenes in the Tales of Ise, where the protagonist, Narihira, is exiled from Kyoto and has to move east in Japan. This is from a 17th century, a very early 17th century book with images included, and this is the first visual reference to this tale. We see Narihira moving east, looking at Mount Fuji with two of his retainers in the foreground and a few clouds in between, a few mountains. And now you might say, okay, these pictures look pretty similar already, but the Edo public was trained on looking at these visual references. Now this is kind of a bad example because the image on the left, which is the mitate of the image on the right, went through a lot of iterations to eventually come up with this. So in the image of the left, we see, of course, Mount Fuji, very clear, but we see a woman on a horse looking left and a man guiding the horse and the woman with a pipe in his hand, etc. Through various iterations that came between these two, the image on the left is a late 18th century iteration. People would gain these kinds of visual cues. They would keep being able to link the visuals to the image on the right. So in the end, it was kind of a puzzle. If the commoners would see such a woodblock print, they would see, oh, there's these visual cues. That's a reference to the Tales of Ise, and they found that fun. Now, in the late Edo period, you would also have that these kinds of mitate techniques would become critical of the shogunate. Now, in the mid-19th century, the power of the shogunate, the authoritative power, declined through various things like natural disasters, the 1830 Temple famine, you'd have the 1855 Ansei earthquake, and of course also political problems, of which one of the most important ones is the arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853, who kind of caused Japan to open up to the other countries and be able to receive visitors again, which was not received well by many of the Japanese because they called us the barbarians, which is already case in point. Because of these things, the populace grew critical of the government, and they could use mitate as a tool for critique because depicting current events in these nishiki-e, in these woodblock prints, was highly illegal by the shogunate. Now here's another example, one that I like. This is a mitate of a battle scene of, in 1863, southern domains rose up against the shogun, but that was, of course, illegal to depict. So what Kawanabe Kyosai did is he replaced the samurai with frogs, which would make it not very illegal anymore, or at least there would be a case to not call it illegal. Through visual cues, people could kind of understand what was going on. In the bottom right, you can see the wheels of the cannons have a six-leaved hollyhock, which was a symbol of one of the allied domains of the shogun. So you could say that the right part of the print was the shogunate's army, and the left are the rebels. So yeah, this is a good example of a critical mitate. Now my research is about these different kinds of mitate, and the different genres they were incorporated in and how they changed. So in the Edo period, you'd have one genre called kawaraban, which is kind of a proto-newspaper that focused on recent events and gossip. These were sold by yomiuri, who would kind of sing the news on corners of the streets. The contents were often more than not natural disasters and what happened, who died, how many people died, and gossip and other strange occurrences that people would be interested in. But also political events, but only really in the last 10 years of the Edo period, because, of course, news was still illegal to distribute. People would be executed if they would do this. But again, through mitate, it was still possible to do this, to make these kawaraban and to publish them. One example of a kawaraban is this image right here. These are called namazue, which come forth from the 19th century creation myth belief that beneath Japan, a giant catfish upholds the country. And the Kashima deity, which is one of the Shinto deities of Japan, they hold these catfish in place. He holds this catfish in place with a sword. But coincidentally, once a year they have an annual deity meeting. So he has to leave, and whenever he leaves and he can't hold the catfish anymore with his sword, the catfish starts to wiggle, which causes earthquakes. And that is what they believe that caused the earthquakes. Coincidentally, catfish are also gods of rejuvenation, and these two beliefs culminated in the image of a catfish being used to portray the 1855 Ansei earthquake, because portraying the earthquake was, of course, still illegal. But not only that, by coincidence, samurai neighborhoods were hit harder by the earthquake than regular common neighborhoods because of the geographical laying of Tokyo or Edo at the time. And at the same time, commoner jobs like builders and woodworks, crafters, they thrived because they had to rebuild Edo, which you can also see in the print. This print portrays a few different kinds of people. You'd have a samurai who's kind of frowning. You'd have people that are crying, like a moneylender. But then you'd also have people laughing and being happy with the catfish. Such as I think it's an architect down in the bottom. And these would give blessings to the catfish, thanking them for rejuvenating the socio-economic status of several people that had it difficult before the earthquake, right? So the commoners. So it would also be seen as a kind of critique against the elite, against the shogunate. Now we go over to the Meiji period. So in 1868, we'd have the Meiji Restoration, where the southern domains rose up against the Tokugawa shogunate. And the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji Emperor came in power. And with it came a lot of modernization, westernization, and especially liberalization, which made it that depicting the news and current events was not illegal anymore. Western-style newspapers did start to exist in the 1870s, but they still had a very small readership. So most people were still interested in nishiki-e, in woodblock prints, as they were still popular. Now, one genre of nishiki-e that I would like to analyze for my research of the changing ways of mitate and parodic illustrations is Shinbun nishiki-e, which literally translates to newspaper prints, where the news was conveyed in a visual way with text incorporated, retelling the event. However, there is no case of mitate present in this paper, in this woodblock print, which might seem logical because, of course, it wasn't illegal anymore, so it wasn't necessary anymore. However, I still believe that they are still very critical. Because I looked at 1,000 published prints that do exist, and about 75% are, of course, as you can see, I might have should have put a disclaimer: if you don't like blood, don't look at the screen right now. 75% of them are very violent, grotesque, and gory, which kind of go against the idea of the Meiji government of being prosperous and modern, etc. So you can ask yourself, is this a coincidence or a hidden critique? I say it's a critique, especially considering Katsuya Hirano's theory of grotesque realism, with which I will analyze these prints, which it's kind of a lot to go into now, but generally it says that grotesque images can hold a critique against a authoritative power. Now, I would also want to look at similar events that occurred. So we had the 1855 Ansei earthquake, which had a lot of mitate and catfish. But we also have the 1891 Nobi earthquake, in which well, in the prints as well, but in real life, there was also a visual dichotomy between the damage that occurred to Western-style buildings and Japanese-style buildings. As we can see, no catfish in the print. So you could maybe tie that to the rationalization of the people of Japan. I don't know yet. I have yet to see and how that kind of evolved. But also no mitate. There is no mitate present in these prints. But again, these prints were still critical, right? Because it would depict that Western-style buildings were often more than not destroyed, and Japanese-style buildings were not. It's really, you can really see it in this print, but there are many prints which do depict this dichotomy between the two. Some scholars argue that it is not critical against East versus West, but against the elite upper classes, just like the 1855 Ansei earthquake prints, because it was the elite of Japan that could afford, that could build these Western-style buildings as well. So in a sense, it ties these two events, these two earthquake events together. So I'd be looking at that. And then last, I would like to compare the Edo period mitates to late Meiji mitate, which did in fact exist, contrary to what I just said, that many of these kinds of prints did not include mitate anymore. There are late Meiji mitate from specific artists like Kawanabe Kyosai, Tsukiyoki Yoshitoshi, and Kiyochika. And the image on the right here is a print of Yoshitoshi's 32 Ghosts collection, in which we can see Jigoku Daiyu, who is the adoptive daughter of Ikkyu, the son of the emperor. And she was a former courtesan, as we can see from her dress and her hairdo, of course. And in the background, she's meditating, and she sees a skeletal procession, a skeletal courtesan procession, of which she would take part in a former life, because she was also a courtesan. And she's kind of meditating on the impermanence of life, right, and the errors of her past life. Now, this is all made up by me, but you could technically say that for people to see this in 1892, it was published, by the way, 1892. For people to see this, they could maybe see themselves in Jigoku Daiyu as a way to contemplate on the errors of the past life, or maybe at the time of the Edo period, right? Because courtesans were also very staple of the Edo period, I think. So you could say that it is kind of a hidden critique against the shogunal years, and that we have now passed these years and are starting a new life in enlightenment, etc. I hope that made it a little bit clearer. It might not have. So it was a lot of information, but in the end, I would just like to see the dynamics between satirical techniques, mitate, when did it end, and in what genres did it not end, etc., and why especially, because no research on that has been done yet. I think that's it. Yes, thank you. I hope the sound was all right.
Well, hello everyone. I'm the last student speaker today, and my name is Xuan Li, the PhD student from Fudan University in China and the University of Leiden. It's my pleasure today to present you on the topic of the transformation from Chinese export porcelain figures to European chinoiserie ceramic figures in the 18th century. And the presentation today is part of a chapter of my PhD thesis on Chinese export porcelain figures. And it will discuss how European ceramic factories responded to these Chinese figures and how those figures were appropriated into the European art system. The case study today concentrates on porcelain Buddhist deities. However, I will not delve deeply into the religion's conceptions and the theories, but rather highlight the interaction and dialogue of shape and design between the Chinese ones and the European versions. To begin with, I would like to introduce some production details from the 17th and 18th centuries. As shown on this map, three main kilns in southeast China, Jingdezheng, Dehuai, and Shiwan, produced large quantities of diverse porcelain figures. Buddhist deities were particularly popular in the domestic market due to the secularization of religion at that time, which also promoted them to be a favorite for export. Export porcelain figures have an abundance of enamel palettes, as illustrated in the chart here. There are underglassed, overglassed, and color glassed. Actually, blandishing, also known as white glassed porcelain, is the most dominant type of export porcelain Buddhist figures. But I would like to emphasize the diversity of representations of Buddhist porcelain figures. There are 5 main deities figures: Buddha, Damo, Guanyin, Luohan, and Budai. Although all these deities have been fully created and designed in various flat visual or sculptural arts, Guanyin and Budai are undoubtedly the leading roles in export porcelain figures. Firstly, Guanyin, the Buddhist goddess associated with compassion and mercy, enjoys the most diverse manifestations in porcelain figures. She is identifiable by her flowing white robes, crown or high bun, and a necklace. She can be depicted individually, either seated or standing, and sometimes with mounts or with her 2 acolytes, Longnu and Shancai, just the girl and the boy, or holding a baby. And the last form, Guanyin with her companions, was extremely popular in Europe, likely due to its presumed association with the Virgin Mary in the Catholic faith. Another deity, Budai, an incarnation of the future Buddha, was also popular in the European market with several manifestations. He is characterized by a laughing face, rotund belly, shaven head, and open robes. Sometimes holds a bowl or a ball, symbolizing fortune. These porcelain figures deities have been in great demand in Europeans since the 17th century and soon became a significant influence on European chinoiserie ceramic figures. From the late 17th century to the end of the 18th century, European ceramic factories, such as those listed here, reproduced the Chinese prototypes in many variants. These reproductions were not synchronized. They have their own unique trajectory, but in terms of the degree of transformation, basically we can divide these transformations into 3 main stages: the emulation and adaptation and recreation. In the first stage, emulation, European versions faithfully represented the shapes of the Chinese originals. In Meisen's earliest porcelain production, leading by the remarkable designer Botge, a number of Oriental figures served directly as models and were transformed into plaster molds. The molds then were filled with stoneware or porcelain material. In that way, these copies were almost identical to their prototypes in general shape and subtle details, but slightly smaller than the Chinese original due to the dehydration during the drying process of the still moist molded mass and the contraction of the ceramic material during firing. Similarly, in Delft, the emulation can also be seen, and the Delft faience is more richly expressed in the glass colors, referencing the palettes of Chinese blue and white or Yixing stoneware and the Japanese kakimon. Some vague sculptural details are outlined by the colors in lines, such as the facial features and the clothing decorations. Though crude, the colorful representations of Delft versions were better suited to Europeans' tastes than the modest palettes of Chinese ones, and they earned higher praise. And then turning to the second stage of adaptation, variations occurred in both shape and decoration, manifesting in 2 ways. The first way involved recombining inherent elements. Elements on the same porcelain figures could be copied and then used to replace another part of the prototype. Just as the picture, I would like to take the transformation of Guanyin with acolytes as an example. Delft faience Guanyin, the left girl, Longnu, was replaced by the model identical to the right boy, Shancai. Yeah. And then become this one. And on another faience figure, the acolytes were eliminated and the bottle in the background was copied and enlarged. And this is the result. Additionally, features from other figures could also be incorporated as well, such as the Delft chinoiserie god. He was a combination of a bearded face of another Chinese deity and the body of Budai. Yes. And the second way involved adding new elements to the composition. These elements were mostly new stimuli in Europe, emphasizing the emblematic contentment with Oriental luxuries and symbolizing their origin from exotic world. In Budai's transformation, teacup sets and the tobacco pipes are 2 essential notable additions. Yes. And in other cases, hats and the musical instruments were also included. We can also see same transformations in Meisen creations. They used the model of the emulation as a base and also add some interesting elements. A special item I would like to emphasize is actually in the collection of Rijksmuseum, just in the right corner, the one with a snack twine around Budai's neck. Actually, I could not give a definitive conclusion, but I can offer some clues. According to some Buddhist legend, and it says that Budai's incarnation is an Indian snake catcher. So here I would like to raise a question. Can we infer that at this stage, the adaptation of Buddhist porcelain figures has already been based on the preliminary knowledge of Eastern religion? Well, just keep that question in mind, and let's move into the third stage, which could be labeled essentially as a recreation, because these chinoiserie figures distanced themselves from their original Chinese prototypes. Firstly, the budai. We can see below in the two earlier stages, they are all seated cross-legged. But here we can see more movements occurred and was shown in a more dramatic and exaggerated way. The two French Buddha is an example. It's become very vividly. And subsequently, the transformation went deeper. On one hand, typical features like Buddha's large ears and the smiling face were returned to allow us to trace their origins. But on the other hand, more subsidiary elements were added and considered part of Buddha's standard configuration, such as the pagoda-like picked hat and the hair and the jar, which may have originated from the Buddha's bag. And actually, Budai in Chinese means bag. Furthermore, an interesting case from the Rijksmuseum, also in the on the right, gave Budai a Japanese geisha's hairstyle, which reminds me of a Meissen example of a chinoiserie lady. I think she also appropriated Budai's figure with the addition of a hat and the earrings, because I find an evidence of a print in a German print depicting a court dinner shows a Buddha wears earrings. The two examples seem to show that direction of Buddha's transformation is to feminize him. Anyway, during this stage, the identity of Buddhist porcelain figures underwent significant shifts. European consumers redefined them to represent a wide range of exotic attributes, known as a pagoda or magot, transcending their original Buddhist context to become common chinoiserie figures. As a pagoda or a magot, porcelain Buddha figures participated in a more Europeanized transformation. A typical Meissen sample incorporates Buddha into the design of the Harlem Queen, in the sense that Buddha was in fact a Harlem Queen for entertainment. Another example is interpretation in teapot. The left Western boy riding a swan is a clear reference to the Buddha riding a rooster on the right. And such a design seems to have inspired the Chelsea Buddha's teapots, showing him grabbing a parrot or a snake. In recreation stage, adaptations tended to be curiosity-based and much freer. So come to the conclusion. It is obvious that throughout the transformation, the religion symbol of the Buddhist export porcelain figures emphasized in the Chinese context has been neglected. From a European perspective, Chinese porcelain figures represented the typical Oriental images of vision or exoticism. This definition formed the base of European understanding and translation, leading to a deliberate intensification of those exotic elements. Europeans, through the prism of their own idea and tastes, inserted the other into their own culture. And that's all. Thank you for your listening.
Okay. So I'm setting my timer to make sure I allow for some time at the end for questions. I certainly have no intention of taking up the entire last half hour. And I've made some probably quite incomprehensible notes for myself that I'm trying to decipher as I talk you through this final section. So the first thing I want to say is I want to pay my compliments to the presenters who did an incredible job. I thought they really did some wonderful things. And in order to remind you of how well they did, I want to tell you about some of the difficulties that anyone who has to present their research, especially when they're still in the middle of that research, so to remind you of how difficult this is. And many of you who are members of the KVVAK are used to listening in this same space to very accomplished, very senior scholars who do this all the time. It takes time to learn it. It takes time to learn how to keep time. And they all did an amazing job. I didn't intervene at all, and we still have half an hour at the end. That's an impressive achievement, yes. That is really impressive. But other difficulties that you encounter when you have to present include language. Every single one of these presenters was not presenting in the language that they grew up speaking, right? All of them, and they did a great job. But it also, you know, as an audience, we have to tune in, and sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's more difficult, and it was good, somebody who said your voice disappears a little bit. All of the speakers, me included, have to pay attention to how you use your voice, to communicate, and it's something we all have to keep practicing. But you could see that these are things that you learn and that you practice and you get better at. Another difficulty that you have when you have to present your research is that you have to balance the amount of information you provide and the amount of argument and reflection that you give. And this is not just a problem for researchers who have to present their work in a very short time. The same problem, as we were discussing this morning, is what the curators face when they have all this research and wonderful objects and 60 words on a label. It's always a balancing act. And again, I think in some of the papers we had a lot of information, and that can be quite difficult to comprehend all of it. Sometimes the arguments are still in process, but we could see that all of them had both. They had arguments and they had lots of information and lots of images. And that's the next point that we all have to learn, and that I still continue to struggle with in my teaching and my presentations. You have to present an image, you have to use the image in your analysis, but you also have to get the audience to see what you are seeing. You have to take them into the image. And sometimes it works well, sometimes it's quite hard to do, and you will have seen different examples of this while you were listening. And how do you tell the story? How do you tell something that gets across what you want to say in a very short amount of time, while also keeping it entertaining and interesting? And I think they all did a really great job. So I'm going to give them one more applause. So what is it that, if you stand back from it, they are interested in, and how does that relate to the changes, more broadly speaking, in the field of the study of Asian art? And I think that can be organized around a set of questions, and the questions that were in the background of these papers that may have been in your minds as you were listening, and that was certainly part of our conversations this morning, include questions like, what is art? You know, was all of it, was everything we saw art? I think it was art in a variety of ways, right? And we have different opinions on this, and the opinions have changed over time. Somebody mentioned this morning, I think it was Menno, that there was a division between the major art in the middle of the gallery and the lesser art, was it? Or the minor art. You know, those divisions used to be very much part and parcel of the study of art history. We don't make those distinctions anymore, but that also means that when you see these presentations on, broadly speaking, Asian art, you will have seen some things where different members of this audience will have had an opinion over whether that is art or not. And I think it's become a very fluent debate in which people have very different opinions. And it has to do with what kind of things are included and what are excluded, which things are on display and which things are in storage. How do we think about the things that are in storage or that are at the back of the display cabinet or never even included into the conversation? I think it's a big issue and it's in flux, and you can see the ongoing questions. It's also a question of who do we study when we study Asian art? Who are the people that we look at? And in the not so distant past, we used to just think about the great creators, the geniuses, the kind of outstanding figures, and the lesser figures in that same kind of hierarchical study wouldn't really feature. I think the cast of characters that we think about when we think about art has become much greater, and we've seen that here too. So it's not just the people who create the individual pieces of art, it's all the participants, all of those who produce, who make, who prepare materials, who are part of the process of creating art. And that means that we might also have the tobacco rollers, or we might also have the people in the background. We might also see the less successful creators. I think it's created a much more dynamic environment in which we see agency, creative agency, in a much wider range of the population, much more diverse, much more blended and fluid in terms of their identities. And it's made it more interesting in many ways. So that's, I think, so what is art? Who makes art? Where is it made? I think the spaces have really changed. I think conventionally, spaces of Asian art would have been divided up into large, mostly national units, maybe units shaped by dominant religious groups. It's really changed. Now the field is, first of all, very interested not just in dominant majority cultures, but in the interactions that happen at the edges of that happens in the interaction between high and low, between the minority groups in a majority culture. And when we think about it, we realize then that majority cultures are discourses and narratives created from hierarchical positions. So the spaces in which we see art and the way in which we organize the galleries thereby have to change. And it's a difficult process in which some of the things that we associate with Asian art suddenly have to fight with those things that might not have been included before. And I think we saw some interesting examples of that too in this case. I think we have a much broader approach to the media that we think of as being part of art. And that's, in this case, we've hardly seen any of the very contemporary forms and media that are part of the conversation now. But I think that it's not just about where, but it's also where in the sense of the surface, the media, the materiality. It's expanded and thereby made it more difficult for the things that we think of as conventional types of art, porcelain, silk, sculptures, for example, bronzes, because they suddenly have to be combined with all kinds of other aspects and other disciplines to study them. So we've seen a range of disciplines on display here that is also much wider than we might have seen them before. So I think, broadly speaking, these kind of questions have really changed. And inevitably, if the questions change about what is art and what's the medium and where is it made and who makes it, then the answers, the outcomes of the ongoing research, are also quite different. And if we just go back, so I had some of the PowerPoints in advance, but of course I didn't know what they were going to say about those PowerPoints because I didn't see the talks before, and so I just picked very quickly some images, but they'll allow me, hopefully, to come back to some of these questions and reflect on the ways in which they explored them. And the kind of concepts that I will come back to at the end that I think run through these kind of presentations include issues around transculturality, intermediality, and agency, and possibly the decoloniality of that agency. I'll come back to those in a moment. So I'm sorry that I picked this one. I would have liked to pick one of the other images now that I've heard Koen's talk. But Koen took us, for example, to a very different space, and he took us to a different kind of medium, so photography. He took us into a group of agents that are quite different from the agents we conventionally see. We see laborers, we see people on the edges of society, we see people who have migrated into different political and cultural contexts. We see people from the lower levels of society combined with the power holders who've created this visual material that he's working with. My questions very often as I was listening to Koen were around what is the medium itself doing? How is the photography working? You were talking about it as if these images were documents of a social reality that can be disentangled by looking at the images. And of course, as you very clearly said, you know, these are power structures, these are arguments that are being made about power and about status and about achievement. But there are also interesting questions about the composition of the image, the way in which people are foregrounded and put in the background, the way in which the technology of the medium at the time worked. Anyway, I think lots of interesting things will come out of this project, and maybe in a few years we can hear an update on how this work is developing. I'm very curious about what's going to happen there next. Then we had, so that was Koen van der Lijn's talk, and then secondly we had the talk by Ruowei. And I think here we can maybe discuss this kind of topic that used to be very broadly speaking referred to as interaction. And not 10 years ago, that was a very common way of saying there are interactions between East and West, and we can see the relationship between Pronk, the creator, the plate in China, the porcelain lady, then made in Europe, as a series of arrows going back and forth and basically showing that there was interaction in the process. And I think when you hear Ruowei talk about this same topic that we've heard about before, a whole new world opens up in which different agents actually come to the fore, namely all of the participants in that process are not just passive recipients of the influence of an image from outside, but they create something new, and in the process of creating that, we see a very different process at work, and it's different disciplines that then have to be considered, such as the botanical images of Maria Sibylla Merian, or the discipline of botanical knowledge, or we have to think about the natural sciences and the ways in which that process brings to the fore a much more active, creative process. We see how complicated the interactions, a much more entangled story, a much messier story in a way than the one that simply points out from one part of the world to the other part of the world and goes back and forth in arrows. And I think agency and transculturality are really the kind of terms that are happening there rather than a more simple interaction. So very interesting work again that we look forward to seeing more of. And then we had this. I mean, who knew this whole world existed? And this, I would say, is an example of the different spaces, the different agents, the different stories that are being told, the different ways at looking at material culture that actually tell us a great deal. It tells us a great deal about a moment in history, this time capsule element that Jan Hu was talking about, and the kind of problematics in it. I thought it was very interesting to hear about her interpretation of some of the text there as very clearly racist. And I think what we could learn from this and how this relates to a broader development in the field is that these are also political stories. These are also stories that actually have to do with hierarchy and power, that have to do with relationships that were very exploitative at one stage. They were propaganda in another way. They were part of a religious mission in another way. And these stories have changed over time, and we view them very differently. And for a young scholar to look at these materials now and to identify both the interesting material that's preserved in there in a sort of time capsule way, but also the ongoing practice of racist views, colonial views really, that are still present even in the process of renewing the museum. So again, different spaces, different actors, different views, but very interesting to look at. And then here, with Zeno Grotenboer's work, a world for me that I knew nothing about, and when I made this slide, I thought, well, I'll just put this image in, that looks quite nice. Now, having heard the talk, you know, suddenly I see the skeletons, and didn't pay any attention to them. Suddenly I see the frogs. I had I was not really looking. It's a typical example of somebody who tells you the background story and suddenly you look at it differently. Your eyes open to it. And I thought that I learned a great deal there about the ways in which art continues to function as a critical voice. The ways in which critique and can be hidden, can change when things move from illegality to legality, but continue to have this voice of commentary and looking at it with the eyes of someone who has an awareness of the political message behind it is a very different story than one who looks at this as something about a particular medium or a particular artist. And I think that too, the kind of political message behind art is a message that hasn't gone away, but is reinterpreted by every generation of scholars of Asian art. And then finally, we had a brilliant presentation about objects that made us all laugh because we suddenly could see how these things had evolved. So it maybe goes back to the idea of interaction or transculturality, but we see that as a process. Suddenly, by putting these objects next to each other, we see that interaction or transculturality or even transmediality, when it crosses media, is never a static process. It's never something that goes from A to B. It's the two that's so interesting, the way in which we go from one to the other. So all of them presented really interesting work that you can connect to broader ideas that are happening in the field of art history. It also connects to the discussions we had in the morning, which were around how are the objects displayed in the Asian pavilion, and how might we want to change it. Lots of discussion about QR codes, lots of suggestions about how their stories can be more dramatic and more accessible, and how they could be contextualized more. And I wanted to end, even though I've just got those terms and I've told you a great deal, I want to add one more, and I didn't have a chance to add it, and that's that word context. We talked about it in the morning, it came up in the presentations now, and there is a sense in those discussions that context is a neutral bit of information that helps you to understand something better. If you have context around a statue, a piece of sculpture, or if you have the context around a piece of ceramics, then you know the story, then you can answer it. I think what we've seen in all of the presentations, and I think this is why it's an important thing for the curators also to keep in mind, although I'm sure they already are very well aware of it, context is a choice. Context is an interpretation. Context is a narrative or a way to tell the story. So even though there is always an attempt to say, I have now found the context for this object, actually, that is an intervention. That is a way of interpreting an object by situating it in a particular context. And that process of deciding what the right context is for an object, for a way of looking at it, that is actually the process of interpreting it. And that's never static. That's never the same. It's never the case that you can take one object, give it its context, and then we know what it is. It always changes. It changes because new generations of scholars arrive. It changes because new technologies are available. It changes because new archives open up and new participants come to the fore who also have stories to tell and contributions to make. And out of all of those new interactions and new communications come new interpretations, new contexts, and shed new light on the objects. So taken together, I think having a group of people who are at an early stage of their studies share their views on the objects in the gallery, on the objects in the collection, on the objects that they are researching, is a great opportunity for us to think, what could we do? How could we retell the stories? How can we rethink? We should never just sit back and say, we already know all that. Right? We should be open to these new stories. And that's why having this young scholar network day, as it was today, symposium, as it hopefully will be in a year's time, is such a wonderful opportunity. So I'm really pleased that you were all here to participate in that conversation. And I think now we still have about a few minutes for questions, 8 minutes. So if we could have the lights so that it's a bit easier to see the audience, and if somebody could help with the microphone. You have one already. Okay. So are there any questions for any of the speakers? Or observations or thoughts?
Yes, I would have a question for Ruowei Dai.
Yeah, come, why don't you all come here? That's a good idea. So the question's for you. Okay.
This is not my field of expertise. I was fascinated by your talk on parasols, but I'm a bit familiar with parasols in Indonesia.
In the parasols from Indonesia?
Yes, in the traditional societies of insular Southeast Asia, parasols popping up in sultanates, or niyas, in Indo-Javanese settings. And it would seem to me that parasols in Indonesia have a much stronger religious significance than the sort of cultural settings you talked on. And it's often about rulers there's a sort of mediation of blessings coming from the spirits and the ancestors, which are sort of suggested by these parasols which rulers are carried, or which are carried by people around them above their heads. It's very prominent also, for example, in Nias, the island of Nias, off the coast of Sumatra. You see that very clearly, but you see it also on Sulawesi and on sultanates on the coasts of Borneo. So would you have, so briefly, you very much stressed profane meanings of parasols in the settings you were talking about. And what I'm saying is that when I look at Indonesia, at parasols, I also see religious meanings.
Well, thank you for your information. I think there are various parasols in the East Asia at that time, but for the Dutch in Batavia and in that area, they cannot catch too much meaning of the parasol in that region, especially about the religion, I think. So, especially for the Dutch artist Cornelis Prank, I don't think he had so much idea about so much meaning about, yeah.
people in Indonesia.
Yeah, and for the merchant in Batavia and in the East Asia, I think the parasol is mainly about the power and the status for these people, not about the other things. It's just to show their wealthy and their power in that region. Yeah, maybe I will do a deeper research about the showing method and way of parasols in the East Asia later. So maybe we can talk after this conversation. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Zeno. Thank you for the fascinating talk. It really touches upon my own research on late Edo fiction, so pleased to meet you. So my question is about your kind of statement about the 75% gory pictures and kind of you connecting violence to satire. And I was wondering, because I was once confronted with a picture of a picture book for children, and it was black and white, it was monochrome print. And the only thing the child colored was the blood and the gore and the violence of these samurai warriors, fighting each other. So how much did you factor into your research that it's just a pleasure or kind of the rile of seeing violence that is maybe primary in a situation? Because maybe my first instinct is everything satirical, or is there maybe an easier explanation? Can you, for example, say, well, violence just sells better? How did you factor in this kind of thought into your research?
Does it work? It does. The simple answer is I haven't yet, but thanks for the suggestion. It's of course a difficult question, right? Because it's a news source, and news sources do cover violent aspects of society. So there might be a coincidence that 75% is, of course, kind of covering violent things. Second to that, it was, of course, also a time of relative peace, the early Meiji period, I think. Well, you had the rebellion, of course, but people weren't used to seeing battles and blood and gore, I believe. I don't know for sure, so if someone can enlighten me. So, of course, it might be a spectacle to see it. However, there is a point to be made between the text and image interplay. Chelsea Foxwell wrote a good article on this. I don't remember the exact definitions she gave to the text-image interplay, but she also kind of went over how these texts undermine Meiji liberal values in a way that it would offer critique towards the Meiji government. However, she only looked at the text aspect, and I would like to also look at the general topic of Shinbun Nishikie that is presented to the populace at the time, which was very violent. So next to that, of course, the theory of grotesque realism, which is kind of controversial, but that clearly states something about seeing violence in a time of peace and prosperity as a way to just, I don't know, undermine the peace and prosperity that is actually present, and stating that it wasn't against the government, something like that. But I'll keep it in mind. I think that's actually a very good point. So thank you.
Hello, I'd like to make a point about the museum and style. I thought that was really interesting to see. One point I wanted to make, though, was that often in terms of discussion of missionary collections and missionary museums, it's kind of assumed that the missionary society itself is pretty much dead. But actually, the style missionaries are hugely successful. I believe that their seminary for training priests in the Philippines is actually the largest Catholic seminary in the world. And the difference is that most of the style missionaries today are actually from from Asian or also African countries. So they're actually from the areas in which the original European missionaries worked. So I was wondering, have you thought how do the modern missionaries from China, from other Asian countries, how do they view the collection and the museum in style? Because I know that many actually go back to style, to the kind of mother house, and you think, okay, what do they make of how their own culture is presented?
Thank you for your question, and that is a really good question because I happen to be in contact with one of the brothers who currently live in style, and he is Chinese. So I also had the same question to him, like how did he view like the presentation and well, I didn't point it out the word exactly, like decolonization, imperialism. Also, it's very interesting because when I was there doing my research, I was also really careful about my words because I have very little knowledge of Catholicism and I don't want to offend anybody. But he seems to be okay with the presentation. So, yeah.
I suspect he was being polite because it's difficult to criticize your own order. But the displays are very, very 1900 kind of traditional, kind of ethnographic. I think your criticisms were perfectly valid and very much kind of suited to the kind of blood of the martyrs type approach. So I think, yeah, I can't imagine that anybody would be too keen on that display. And I think it's just a case of an old museum that's hasn't been updated. They've just kind of put new things in without really. But also, missionary societies are not. They're not. The people in charge are usually not really trained curators. And they often have no idea what to do with these big collections of which they've been put in charge. But I thought that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, as you said, actually the collection is still under the possession of the congregation, even though it is transformed into a public museum and they have like curators from elsewhere. But still, all these objects are owned by the Catholic congregation. So it is also very hard for the curators there to trying to negotiate with the congregation, but also trying to follow the trend of restitution and decolonization, like the overall narrative nowadays. So I think this is gonna go through a very long-term process of negotiation. Also, I plan to do my research in Vatican this summer, and I hope to find out more information from their secret archive, because this is a problem with things related to Christian congregations. Many of the archives are not published, and even though it's like in the archives room, you have to go through a very strict process. For example, like in Vatican, you have to hand over like your passport and you have to prove that you're actually doing the research. So yeah, but I'm glad that there are like some researchers actually doing the work to dig into. And this is what I hope that I could contribute as well.
Thank you. My question to Romy Dai about Parasol. Okay. Also, as another gentleman's side, this thing is I also believe is originally from Buddhists, and it spread to China in around 5th century. That's why it's never saw in China before 5th century, and it have a special religion meaning in Buddhism. That's why it also became popular in India and Indonesia. Also, you said that kind of exotic painting always mix of different elements. For what I can imagine, if I saw that picture, I will say this is not something from China. It's something mixed by Indonesia culture. And also, I have saw many Chinese Asian paintings, but I never saw in Chinese Asian painting there's a woman with a parasol, and also believe this kind of parasol is not allowed to be used by women. So my question is that you did so many research. Did you see any Chinese painting with almost the same thing like a woman with a parasol? And can you name the source of this painting if you see that?
You mean what kind of painting?
Chinese, you said. Yes. A Chinese painting.
Did you see any source of this painting?
Yes, I think I have mentioned some Chinese resources during my presentation, but it's not quite like the one Prank has shown in his designs. And I think there are several different traditions in East Asia for using the parasol for the women. I don't think they have a direct connection with Prank's design, but maybe I can show you more pictures later. Yeah.
It's hard to see, but I think we may have run out of questions. We certainly have run out of time. So I think we have to wrap it up here. I want to thank everyone who's here for coming. It's been great to have you here. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you come back. If you aren't a member, I hope you become a member, either of the KVVAK or of the KVVAK and Ikigai, if you're lucky to be under 45. With great thanks to the technology team and to the organizers, both Rosaline and Sandra, and please join me in thanking the speakers and everybody else one more time. Thank you.
Even mijn foldertjes hebben.
Great job. Yeah. Shall I take a quick picture of you, all of you speakers? Come and stand in front of the museum.
Oh, is dat?
Dan mag je hem stoppen.